French aristocrat and well-renowned tightrope walker Charles Blondin toured Australia in 1872, then aged 50. Next stop New Zealand, by the way, where he put on a display in the grounds of Government House. Blondin is most famous for being the first person to walk across Niagara Falls, a task he completed 300 times. Inquisitively, I looked up how he died, thinking things must have turned tits up at some stage. Nope. He died at 73 of diabetes with his newly minted 25-year-old bride at his bedside. In the wake of his tour, Australian tightrope walkers were spurred into action. Blondin was synonymous with daredevil tightrope feats, so much so that the Aussie copycats adopted his name to bolster their own credentials. The most famous, but far from the only, Australian Blondin was Henry Lestrange. That's him traversing Sydney Harbour in 1877. He also toured with a death-defying balloon act as well. If jumping out of a balloon sounds a mite safer than walking on a thin rope high above the ground and no safety net, you would be neither wrong nor right. Both meant getting life insurance was nigh on impossible. That cutting on your screen is from New Zealand, a balloon act launched from Lancaster Park that went fatally wrong. The subject of an up-and-coming video only subscribers will get to see. Hint, hint. Lots of stories within stories with this one, as you're just about to find out. Back to Australia and the Australian Blondin number 2, James Alexander, who toured with circuses mostly. As part of his acts, he would ask for volunteers and carry them across on the rope. This resulted in a 13-year-old falling to his death in one performance. The authorities went to prosecute him, only to find out there was no actual specific regulations governing tightropes. Alexander toured New Zealand for the first of 3 times in 1884 with his high wire act, performing in small towns under the name, wait for it, the Australian Blondin. At performances, he still managed to get volunteers from the crowd to traverse the wire, whilst 50 feet above the ground, fry up pancakes for good measure. How did he die? If you thought it was tightrope related, you would actually be right. Only he had a heart attack one day when he was up the rope. We are not, however, done with all the Australian Blondins. Number 3 on our list is Alfred Rowe, who used the pseudonym Onzalo, O-N-Z-A-L-O. You'll see from the screen things didn't go too well for him either. In 1883, during an act which went wrong involving a bicycle and pyrotechnics, Onzalo and his assistants fell 33 feet into the ground. They were both injured but lived to tell the tale. Not so lucky was an 8-year-old boy in the crowd. In the fall, a pole was dislodged, striking the poor lad who died. Rowe now faced manslaughter charges. Now we finally get to the focus of this video, the Colonial Blondin, who was also around the Australasian scene the same time as both those other chaps. The Australian Felix Ernest Tanner was born Charles Jackson in 1863. As a 7-year-old, Jackson was at one of Charles Blondin's events and was smitten, and this is what he wanted to do. His first public performance was an attempt to tightrope across this blowhole on the New South Wales coast. Then he became one of the regular acts at the Bondi Aquarium, by which time he had added trapeze and jumping out of balloons into his repertoire. Still in his teens, he toured India and South Africa before he made it to New Zealand for the first time in 1884, performing as, you guessed it, the Australian Blondin. New Zealand punters got to enjoy themselves seeing him cross the rope blindfolded and dancing the Highland Fling. More troublingly for modern sensibilities, he also wheeled a barrow across the wire. So what are you thinking? Well, inside the barrow was a young child. Some parents had volunteered from the crowd. Back in Australia, he almost killed himself when the balloon he got into was blown 40 miles out to sea in a gust of wind. With a sidekick balloonist dubbed Professor Jackson, he was back in New Zealand in 1889 to 90 as one of the acts at the New Zealand and South Pacific exhibition in Dunedin. I believe Jackson's real name was Thomas Ross, but as I've mentioned at the very start, as you may have noticed in the writing, the names and dates in this material are all over the place. What is not in contention are the events that I am recollecting. Amongst the array of way cool stuff at the exhibition, we are sadly never allowed to see these days, let alone news, was this. A 40-metre wooden replica of the Eiffel Tower, the middle of which Otis had installed one of those newfangled elevators. Because the weather was rather crappy and the balloon was unable to get into the air, Jackson went to plan B. He had invented an emergency device to be used in the event of fires in high-rises. This. The Ross Portable Fire Escape. Looks to me like a primitive bungee of sorts. To help promote his device, Jackson jumped from the top of that tower twice. I know you are probably thinking, what next in terms of madcap acts? Start humming the riff from Bachman Turner Overdrive, please. I'm far from finished here. One of the stage acts I'm going to recollect in a minute or so is actually so dangerous it could lead to this video being age restricted. And, by the way, I don't mean starvation. You see, on getting back to Australia, Tanner, as he was now calling himself, started a new career as a showman. The Starving Man. He hired the Sydney Waxworks, as Sydney actually had a crowd in for their exhibition, and lived on water for 40 days, charging people to come and see him deteriorate the days before Tellier, losing 13 kilograms off his 75 kilo frame. This starving business proved to be more lucrative than tightroping, so he bowled ahead with 3 more fasts in the next couple of years. Tanner had ants in his pants, and then at 38 came to work in what we would consider a semi-normal job here in New Zealand. A gold miner at Waihi in the Waikato region of the North Island. The year was now 1901. 22 years later, the children of the miners and the local farmers would be involved in a school shooting 5 kilometres away. There's a video linked to that one below. At the same time, Tanner began moonlighting. This is where his madcap scheming and attention-seeking went to the nth degree. He designed a gallows, pretending to hang himself in front of paying crowds in country halls. The only clipping I could find on this said that it was so realistic, a woman in the crowd fainted. Moving quickly on. A year doing one thing in one place was an eternity for Mr. Tanner. By now, he was officially, as in wedlocked, to wife number 3, or was it 4, and had approximately 8 kids. He would go on to have 4 more, known ones, as if he hadn't been punished enough already. Using dubious references, he now reinvented himself as a deep-sea diver, when his closest experience at this point to diving was a few months as a wharfie on the Sydney docks. Somehow, through bluff and bluster, he became one of the main divers trying to retrieve the gold from this vessel, the Illingamite. Despite blowing the wreck to smithereens, the venture returned empty-handed. By then, Tanner had had a dust-up with the expedition leader and was now unemployed, living in New Plymouth, when, lo and behold, Providence came sailing into the harbour on the 1st of June 1903 in the form of this vessel. A glorified dugout canoe called the Tillicum. Tillicum means friend in the Chinook language. On board was his eccentric German-Canadian Captain John Voss on the second leg of his circumnavigation of the globe, which started in British Columbia, in what then was the smallest vessel to attempt shuts her feet. Before I move on, because I know you're wondering, 1. Voss did make it, and it took him 3 odd years. 2. I've no idea what the hell that prow on the front of the boat is supposed to be. For Tanner, the spark was now lit. He was going to go one better. He was going to take Voss's record off him and sail around the world in a glorified barrel of his own design. There would be 4 of them, and they would be called Tanner's Arks. I hope I get them all in order, but overall you'll get a good picture. This is one, and it epitomised the folly of his scheme. After using it as an onshore fundraising exhibition piece in New Plymouth, it was taken out into the harbour in front of a crowd of 5,000. Having ignored basic ship design principles, it did what you would expect. It proved unstable even in calm waters and had to be towed ashore. It would later be sunk at its moorings by vandals. He then moved to Wanganui and went back to starving himself to make money. Ark 2 was built and got 10 kilometres offshore before sinking. Number 3 was arguably the most successful. It sailed the best. It made it across the Cook Strait in not the best weather before getting caught in even worse weather, a gale, and the crew were forced to abandon it to its fate. It was in now 1906 and Tanner was down in Wakefield, Nelson, when this photo was taken in his backyard. Unbloody believable, I know. If you don't like this video, you have no soul. Roughly 10 foot in circumference and 2.5 tons. Stay firmly rooted to your chair when I tell you this barrel made it from Nelson to Littleton, use sailing. Then sailed south to Timaru, where it was put on display to once again raise funds. Meanwhile, Tanner was talking up the success of the voyage in Wellington, pumping up the idea of getting it across to Sydney, as well as trying to sell their design patents. In his mind, these were to become the lifeboats of the future. To be fair to the chap, he did have some success with designing stuff. He designed an electric propeller governor, which netted him about $100,000 in modern terms. So what next, you may well ask? No one knows. The trail goes cold. Same in Australia. So no one actually knows where he went from New Zealand. Likely to the United States or possibly back to Australia under an assumed name. The two possible dates of his death are given as 1919 or even 1943. Like a lot of things in his life, there are large gaps and contradictory dates. One thing for sure, he led a wild life and epitomised the term, why be normal? Thanks for making it to the end here. There's a lot more coming up and plenty of stuff in the vault if you are new. I'll see you next time. Bye for now.